Don't ever forget.
On October 21, 1967, one of the most prominent anti-war demonstrations took place as some 100,000 protesters gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, and around 30,000 of them continued in a march to the Pentagon later that night in Washington, D.C. After a brutal confrontation with the soldiers and the United States Marshals protecting the building, hundreds of demonstrators were arrested. One of them was the author Norman Mailer, who chronicled the events in his book, The Armies of the Night, published the following year to widespread acclaim. On October 21, protest in Washington, D.C. inspired the totality of the 1967 anti-war movement that got a big boost when the civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. went public with his opposition to the war on moral grounds, condemning the war's diversion of federal funds from domestic programs, as well as the disproportionate number of African American casualties concerning the total number of soldiers killed in the war. At a march of over 5,000 protesters in Chicago, Illinois, on March 25, 1967, Martin Luther King called the Vietnam War a blasphemy against all that America stands for. The 1967 Vietnam War protest in Washington, D.C. inspired many popular songs that became an anthem for their generation. Phil Oakes wrote, "What Are You Fighting For?" in 1963 and "I Ain't Marching Anymore" in 1965. Other songs whose very titles were a protest unto themselves included Pete Seeger's "Bring 'Em Home" 1966 and Juan Bay's "Saigon Bride" 1967. Nina Simone's "Backlash Blues" 1967 took a civil rights poem from Langston Hughes and adapted it into a protest of Vietnam. "Raise my taxes, freeze my wages, send my son to Vietnam." Martin Gaye's "What's Going On" from 1971 went on to be one of the most popular songs of all time. John Lennon's first song after leaving the Beatles, "Give Peace a Chance," hit the airwaves in 1966. Imagine, from 1971, has transcended the Vietnam era to continue to be a song of peace and unity. The succeeding year, the North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive, and its success against the United States and South Vietnamese troops sent waves of shock and discontent across the home front and sparked the most intense period of anti-war protests to date. By early February 1968, a Gallup poll showed that 35% of the population approved of Johnson's handling of the war, and a full 50% disapproved, while the rest had no opinion. Joining the anti-war demonstrations by this time were members of the organization Vietnam Veterans Against the War, many of whom were in wheelchairs and on crutches. The sight of these men on television throwing away the medals they had won during the war did much to win people over to the anti-war cause. And don't ever forget that in mid-1971, the publication of the first Pentagon Papers, which revealed previously confidential details about the war's conduct, caused more and more Americans to question the accountability of the United States government and military establishments. In response to a strong anti-war mandate, Nixon announced the effective end of the United States involvement in Southeast Asia in January 1973. The Paris Peace Agreement was signed on January 27, 1973. The conflict marked a turning point for how Americans saw the military's place in the world. After being met with years of protests, demonstrations, and activism, including the objections of many notable poets and artists such as Denise Levertov, Allen Ginsberg, and W.S. Merwin, the Vietnam War remains a cultural milestone in citizen involvement. And don't ever forget that. And don't ever forget also to like and subscribe and always push that notification bell.
Don't ever forget